I'm here in an exhibition at the National Museum of American History called Food, Transforming the American Table, 1950 to 2000. The exhibition explores some of the major changes in food and wine in post-war America, from the impact of innovations and new technologies to the influence of social and cultural shifts. It opens with the story of Julia Child, whose cookbooks and televised cooking shows introduced many Americans to French cuisine and changed the way they thought about food and cooking. Her story is told around her home kitchen, which she donated to the Smithsonian in 2001. Here you see the pots and pans and the tools and equipment that she used in her show and in life. These kinds of objects, the things people use every day, can be really wonderful entry points for larger questions about the time period from which they come and can make the past more relatable for students. I chose this exhibition as the site for our first object analysis to emphasize that seemingly ordinary items can be powerful learning tools in the classroom. The object I have here was one that we bought online for just a few dollars. It's an everyday piece but has wonderful lessons to share about its moment in history. To start object-based teaching in your classroom, you'll want to teach students some of the basic skills of observation that help us unlock the stories in objects. I'll do that today in part by sharing typical questions that historians ask of objects, which we can think of as supporting questions within the C3 framework. These are questions such as, what is this object? When was it used? Who used it? From what is the object made? Why would someone have used this object? So one way to help students remember these questions and this approach is to explain that we can think of historians as detectives or investigative journalists. Like them, historians were not witnesses to the event, so they must look to their sources, in this case documents and objects, to uncover the mystery of the past. Learning to observe carefully is a crucial step in building the habits of mind to critically assess sources, including objects. So let's do a sample object reading together. As we do this, you'll see that we're analyzing an object but also scaffolding student learning. So what is this object? Well, we can tell, of course, that it's a book, but what kind? And we can see it's a cookbook by reading the cover, but we can guess that it might have been used in a kitchen too by looking at how it's used. We can note the cup stains on the front and the water stains in the back. And we'll ask, when and where was it produced? Well, we can look inside and see that it was published in 1944 in Chicago. We can consider the materials used to make it. We can see it's paper with a cloth binding, made by machine, probably. But there are lots of details to consider. The ink used for the type and for images that are inside. Even if we didn't have the publication information, we could use some of the clues of its production and the title or other inscription to gauge its time period. Next, we might ask, well, who would have used this? We can look at the title, The Victory Binding of the American Women's Cookbook, and see that it was aimed towards women. And we might guess and discuss gender roles in the period with students. If we turn to page 725, we'll see a section called Entertaining Without a Maid. And on page 711, we'll see that most recipes are made for 6. This section is specifically talking about addressing cooking for a smaller number. We'd want to look at additional sources, but we might guess that this was for a woman with either a large family or many social obligations. Perhaps she was somewhat well off, but again, we'd want to talk with students about looking for additional sources to better understand the context. Were maids common then? More common than they are now? Under what circumstances would someone have a maid in 1944? And where could we look to find this information? So now let's think about why someone would have bought this cookbook. We can see, of course, that the book provides recipes, but specifically, it's recommending ways to cook under the restrictions of rationing. We can see that by turning to section A, which addresses wartime cooking and offers suggestions for substituting alternatives, like honey, for rationed items such as sugar. As we saw in the title, this is the Victory Binding, drawing on the language of victory gardens to support the war effort. With more context and some inference, you can also make comparisons between the past and the present by examining what's on the menu. We can look at the emphasis on red meat, lots of game, and aspic, and limited notes on vegetarian eating, for example. So how might you extend the learning around this object? You could give students an even more personal understanding of this era by using their senses and cooking a wartime meal, or you could have students develop a menu for a week's worth of meals using the cookbook and ration restrictions. Other students may empathize with the human story behind wartime shortages and might benefit from writing an imagined diary entry reflecting on how they might respond under similar circumstances. You can use objects at the start of a lesson or as part of a research project in which students uncover the context of the object through additional primary source investigations. Or you could use this object as an assessment at the end of a lesson. By asking students to explain as much as they can interpret from the object and what they've learned about its historical context, you can assess their understanding of that era in history. Exploring an object is a process that can be used across grade levels. Object exploration models the process of questioning that's essential to historical work, and it involves students in their own learning. It helps students practice the habits of mind needed to do history. The readings for this week provide examples of how to incorporate objects into history classrooms. So how will you incorporate an object into yours? Objects can help students understand a fundamental belief that we hold here at the Smithsonian, that we're all part of our national story and that our actions matter. Objects may help students understand that history isn't just a collection of things that happened in the past. History is the story of the lives of people, of the choices they made, of the consequences of those choices. Objects can help students understand that the lives we live today shape the future, and that the stuff that we leave behind will be the sources that historians study for generations to come. When students study history through objects, history comes to life.